After losing my job, I told my family I couldn't afford presents this year. That's fine, they all said. But at Christmas dinner, my daughter-in-law took the plate from my hand. No gifts for us, no food for you. So I just left. The next morning, she woke up to eviction notices as a present. Turns out the landlord was me. The plate was snatched from my hands so fast I barely had time to register what was happening. No gifts for us, no food for you, Rachel said, her voice dripping with theatrical sweetness that fooled absolutely no one at this table. I stood there in my son's dining room, holding an empty fork like an idiot, while 23 family members pretended not to notice that my daughter-in-law had just publicly humiliated a 68-year-old woman on Christmas Day. That's when I decided Rachel Sullivan was about to learn exactly who owned the roof over her entitled little head. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Let me back up and tell you how I got to that moment, standing in a room full of people who were supposed to love me, being treated like a vagrant at a soup kitchen. 6 months ago, my life was perfectly ordinary. I had a job at Hartford Insurance that I'd held for 12 years, a comfortable routine, and the naive belief that family meant something. Then the company downsized, and suddenly, I was just another statistic in the unemployment line, watching my savings dwindle while trying to maintain some dignity. I'd told David and Rachel about losing my job, of course. What I hadn't told them was that I'd been smart with money my entire life. While they assumed I was struggling, I was actually sitting on a comfortable nest egg that would keep me comfortable for years. But pride made me say those fatal words. I can't afford Christmas gifts this year. The reaction was swift and predictable. That's fine, Mom, David had said, patting my shoulder with the kind of condescending comfort you'd give a child who'd dropped their ice cream. Rachel had nodded along, her smile just a little too bright, her relief just a little too obvious. No expensive gift obligations this year. How convenient for them. What they didn't understand was that I was testing them, testing whether their love came with a price tag attached, testing whether I mattered to them beyond what I could provide. The results were about to become spectacularly clear. Christmas Eve dinner had started normally enough. The dining room was decorated with Rachel's Instagram-worthy holiday display, complete with coordinated linens and artfully arranged pine branches. The extended family was there, David's cousins, Rachel's parents, her sister's family from Boston. Everyone gathered around the massive table that dominated the room, plates laden with the feast that Rachel had spent days preparing to perfection. I'd been seated at the far end, naturally, the overflow section where Great-Aunt Mildred usually sat before she passed away last year. Not quite at the kids' table, but definitely not in the inner circle where the important family members held court. I'd grown accustomed to my peripheral status over the years, but tonight it stung differently. The conversation flowed around me like I was a piece of furniture. Rachel's promotion at the marketing firm, David's latest sales award, Tommy's soccer achievements, Sarah's piano recital, all wonderful things that I would have loved to celebrate with appropriate gifts, if anyone had bothered to ask whether my financial situation might have improved. But they hadn't asked, because they didn't want to know. When Rachel started clearing the dinner plates, I stood to help. Old habits die hard. That's when she intercepted me at the kitchen entrance, blocking my path with practiced efficiency. "Oh no, Mrs. Sullivan," she said, using the formal address she'd adopted since my unemployment became public knowledge. "You just sit and relax. You've done enough." The words were polite, but the underlying message was clear. You're not contributing anymore, so don't pretend you're still part of the team. That's when Rachel made her announcement about Christmas dinner being served only to those who'd participated fully in the holiday celebration. The room went quiet. Someone coughed. David studied his hands like they held the secrets of the universe. What none of them knew was that I held all the cards. Literally. Walking out of that house took every ounce of willpower I possessed, but I managed it with my head held high. I didn't slam the door. That would have given Rachel too much satisfaction. Instead, I simply collected my coat and purse, said Merry Christmas to the room at large, and left. The cold December air hit my face like a slap, but it felt cleaner than the atmosphere I'd just escaped. I sat in my car for exactly 3 minutes, letting the engine warm up and my anger crystallize into something more useful. Then I drove home to my modest apartment on Elm Street, poured myself a generous glass of wine, and opened my laptop. It was time to remind my dear daughter-in-law exactly who she'd been tangling with for the past 6 months. The property management company's website logged me in automatically. Muscle memory from years of handling my investments online. Sullivan Property Holdings LLC showed 11 active rental properties, including one particularly attractive colonial on Maple Drive. The tenant information was all there. David and Rachel Sullivan, lease initiated 3 years ago, never late on rent. Exemplary tenants who had no idea their landlord was the unemployed mother-in-law they'd just ejected from Christmas dinner. You see, when David and Rachel bought their dream house, they'd actually entered into a rent-to-own agreement. The previous owner, that would be me, operating through my LLC, had offered them what seemed like an incredibly generous deal. Low monthly payments, immaculate property maintenance, and a landlord who never bothered them with inspections or demands. They thought they'd hit the real estate lottery. What they didn't realize was that their benevolent landlord was subsidizing their lifestyle while living in a cramped apartment and clipping coupons for show. Every month, they paid me approximately 60% of what that house was actually worth in rent. The difference came out of my pocket, a gift I'd been giving them for 3 years without a word of acknowledgement. The irony was delicious. While Rachel was lecturing me about financial responsibility and cutting me off from family meals, she was living in a house I owned, enjoying below-market rent I provided, raising her children in bedrooms I'd decorated before they'd ever set foot in the place. I'd purchased the house specifically for them, actually. When they'd mentioned wanting to move to a better school district, but worrying about mortgage approval, I'd quietly bought the property through my LLC and crafted the perfect solution. David thought he'd negotiated the deal himself through a lucky connection at work. Rachel thought they'd found their dream home through savvy house hunting. Neither suspected that every detail had been orchestrated by the woman they now considered a financial burden. For 3 years, I'd been their fairy godmother, and they'd never even known it. But fairy tale arrangements work both ways. Just as easily as I'd made their housing dreams come true, I could wake them up to reality. The lease agreement included standard clauses about renewal terms, rent adjustments, and property sale options, all perfectly legal, all thoroughly documented, all leading to a very interesting conversation that was about to take place. I spent Christmas Day reviewing every document, every payment, every improvement I'd made to their home. By evening, I had a complete picture of exactly how much my generosity had cost me over the years. The below-market rent differential alone totaled over $47,000. Add in the improvements, maintenance, and property taxes I'd covered, and David and Rachel had been living off my charity to the tune of nearly $70,000. $70,000 from the woman who was allegedly too poor to buy Christmas presents. The next morning, I called Mrs. Patterson at Prestige Property Management. "Margaret," she said warmly, "Merry Christmas. How was your holiday?" Patricia Morrison had been managing my properties for 15 years. She was one of the few people who knew the full scope of my real estate investments, and she'd never questioned my decision to maintain anonymity with certain tenants. "Educational," I told her. "I need to schedule a property inspection for Maple Drive. Full walkthrough, documentation, the works. And Patricia? I think it's time the tenants met their actual landlord." After I hung up with Patricia, I dressed carefully for the occasion. My best wool coat, the good handbag, the pearl earrings that had been my mother's. Not flashy, but unmistakably expensive to anyone who knew quality when they saw it. Then I drove to Maple Drive, parking across the street from the house I owned to wait for Mrs. Patterson to arrive. Patricia's car pulled up precisely at 2 o'clock, punctual as always. She emerged carrying her official clipboard and wearing her professional smile, every inch the competent property manager. But when she caught my eye, I saw the glimmer of anticipation there. "Ready for this?" she asked as I joined her on the sidewalk. "I've been ready for 6 months," I told her. We walked up the front path together, and I felt a strange sense of homecoming. Patricia rang the doorbell, and we waited. The door opened, and David's face appeared, still wearing yesterday's stubble and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. His expression shifted from mild annoyance to confusion as he recognized me standing behind the property manager. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Patricia stepped forward smoothly. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm Patricia Morrison from Prestige Property Management. We scheduled a routine property inspection for this afternoon. This is Margaret Sullivan, the property owner. The color drained from David's face as the words sank in. But the real shock was yet to come. The moment David processed Patricia's words, I watched 42 years of my son's assumptions crumble in real time. He stood in the doorway, mouth slightly open, looking between Patricia and me like we were speaking a foreign language. "Property owner?" he repeated slowly. "There must be some mistake. My mother doesn't own property. She can't even afford Christmas gifts." Patricia consulted her clipboard with professional efficiency. "According to our records, Sullivan Property Holdings, LLC, has owned this property since October 2021. Margaret Sullivan is the sole proprietor of that company." She handed him a business card. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation inside. These inspections typically take about an hour." David stepped back automatically, and we entered what I'd always considered one of my favorite rooms. The foyer, with its warm cream walls and cherry hardwood floors, looked exactly as I'd envisioned when I'd overseen the renovation before their move-in. "Rachel!" David called, his voice strained. "Can you come here for a minute?" She appeared from the kitchen, wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweater, her hair in a messy bun that somehow looked deliberately styled. When she saw Patricia and me, her expression shifted from casual annoyance to wary concern. "What's going on?" "This is Patricia Morrison from the property management company," David said carefully. And apparently, he trailed off, clearly struggling with how to phrase what he'd just learned. "Your landlord," I finished calmly. "I own this house, Rachel. I've owned it since before you moved in." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the living room. Rachel's face went through several interesting color changes before settling on a pale shade that matched the winter sky outside. "That's impossible," she said finally. "You live in that tiny apartment. You lost your job. You couldn't afford Christmas presents." Each statement sounded less certain than the last, as if she were trying to convince herself rather than me. I unbuttoned my coat and draped it over the antique chair by the front door, the chair I'd selected specifically for that spot. "I live in a modest apartment because I chose to. I told you I couldn't afford gifts because I wanted to see what that information would mean to you. As for losing my job," I shrugged. "That part was true. Hartford Insurance downsized, and I was part of the reduction. But Rachel, dear, I haven't needed a job to survive in over 20 years. Patricia was documenting everything on her tablet, taking photos of each room as we spoke. It was a legitimate inspection, but I knew she was also creating a record of this conversation for legal purposes. "I don't understand," David said, and for the first time in months, he sounded like my son instead of a stranger making polite conversation. "Why didn't you tell us? Why let us think—" "Think what?" I asked gently. "That you were independent adults making your own way in the world? That you'd worked hard to find this beautiful home and negotiate this generous lease agreement? That your success was entirely your own doing?" I walked into the living room, noting the new throw pillows on the sofa, the ones that perfectly complemented the paint colors I'd chosen. I thought those were lovely illusions to maintain. Rachel followed us, her movements sharp and agitated. "This is crazy. You've been lying to us for years." "Have I?" I turned to face her directly. "When did I lie, Rachel? When you assumed I was struggling financially and I didn't correct you? When you decided I wasn't worth including in family decisions and I didn't argue? When you treated me like a burden and I accepted that role?" I kept my voice level, conversational. "I believe what you're experiencing is the difference between deception and simply not volunteering information that was never requested." David sank into his favorite armchair. "Jesus, Mom, all this time we've been paying rent to you, living in your house, and yesterday He couldn't finish the sentence. "Yesterday you decided that a woman who wasn't providing sufficient financial value to your family didn't deserve Christmas dinner," I completed. That was illuminating. We moved through the house systematically. The formal dining room where yesterday's humiliation had occurred. The family room with its built-in entertainment center and gas fireplace. Every detail had been chosen with care, designed to create the perfect family home for my son and his children. As we climbed the stairs to the second floor, David finally found his voice again. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. I've always told you the truth, David. You just haven't always asked the right questions. Are we in trouble? Are you going to—" He paused, clearly struggling with concepts that had never occurred to him before. "Are you going to kick us out?" I stopped at the top of the stairs and turned to look at him. My son, my only child, who had stood silently yesterday while his wife humiliated me in front of our entire extended family. "That depends," I said calmly, "on what happens next." And that's when Rachel made the mistake that would determine everything that followed. "You can't just come in here and threaten us," she said, her voice rising with indignation. "We have rights. We've been model tenants. We've never missed a payment, never caused problems. You can't evict us just because you're angry about Christmas dinner." I smiled at her, the same polite smile I'd worn for years while she'd slowly erased me from her family's life. "Oh, Rachel, you still don't understand, do you?" "What don't I understand?" "You don't understand that good tenants don't usually exclude their landlords from family gatherings." The master bedroom had always been my favorite room in the house. I'd spent weeks selecting the perfect paint color, a warm gray that shifted between silver and sage depending on the light. Standing there now, watching Rachel realize that her sanctuary had been designed by the woman she'd been systematically humiliating, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with truth. "The ceiling fan was a special order," I mentioned casually as Patricia photographed the room. "Took 6 weeks to arrive, but I thought the antique bronze finish would complement the warm undertones in the wall color." Rachel's face had gone from pale to flushed and back to pale again. She stood rigidly beside the king-sized bed, another housewarming gift from their generous landlord, watching me catalog improvements she'd been living with for 3 years without knowing their source. David sat heavily on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked, without looking up. "Planning what?" I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. "This revelation, this moment. How long have you been waiting to drop this bomb on us?" Patricia was now in the ensuite bathroom, documenting the condition of the marble countertops and the rain shower I'd upgraded before their move-in. Her professional presence was a calming influence in what could have easily become an emotional scene. "I wasn't planning anything, David. I was hoping." I moved to the window, looking out at the backyard where 8-year-old Tommy's swing set occupied the corner I'd specifically landscaped for children's play equipment. I was hoping that when circumstances changed, when I lost my job, when money got tight, my family would respond with love instead of arithmetic. "We did respond with love," Rachel interjected, but her voice lacked conviction. "Did you?" I turned back to face them, because from where I was sitting yesterday, love looked a lot like conditional acceptance based on financial contribution. David finally raised his head. "That's not fair, Mom. We've always included you." "Have you?" I kept my voice gentle, but I wasn't going to let that statement pass unchallenged. "When was the last time you invited me somewhere that didn't require me to bring something? When was the last time you called just to talk, not because you needed a babysitter or a favor?" We finished the inspection in the guest room, the room that had been intended as my occasional retreat when babysitting or visiting, the room where I'd imagined staying during holiday visits, close enough to help with children's nightmares or early morning excitement, the room I'd never actually used, because somehow I'd never been invited to stay overnight in my own house. Patricia completed her documentation and tucked her tablet into her bag. "Everything appears to be in excellent condition," she announced. "I'll have the report completed by tomorrow morning." "Thank you." "Patricia, I'll walk you out." At the front door, Patricia paused. "Will you be making any changes to the current arrangement?" she asked quietly. I glanced back toward the living room, where David and Rachel were having an intense whispered conversation. "I'll let you know by the end of the week," I said. After Patricia left, I returned to find David and Rachel sitting close together on the sofa, clearly having reached some kind of decision during my brief absence. "Mom," David said, standing as I entered the room, "we need to talk." "I'm listening." Rachel cleared her throat. "We want to apologize for yesterday. It was wrong, and we're sorry. We were stressed about the holidays, and we took it out on you." It was a perfectly crafted apology, the kind Rachel was skilled at delivering when the situation required damage control. But I'd heard enough of her professional presentations to recognize corporate speak when it was aimed at me. "Thank you for the apology," I said. "I accept it." Relief flickered across both their faces. "However," I continued, "an apology addresses the past. I'm more interested in discussing the future. David frowned. What do you mean? I mean that yesterday revealed something about our relationship that can't be fixed with words. You both made decisions about my value to this family based entirely on my perceived financial status. I looked around the room one more time, the room I'd designed as a gathering place for family memories, conversations, and connections. The room where yesterday I'd been treated like an unwelcome stranger. We start by acknowledging reality, I said. This is my house. You are my tenants. And our family relationship exists entirely separately from that business arrangement. Rachel's face went pale again. What does that mean? It means that loving family members and good tenants are two different categories. Yesterday, you failed to qualify for the first category. I picked up my coat and purse. Now we get to see which category you'll choose to focus on going forward. I was halfway to the door when David called after me. Mom, wait, are you going to evict us? I paused with my hand on the doorknob, considering how to answer that question honestly. David, I'm going to do exactly what any reasonable landlord would do when they discover their tenants don't respect them. The look of panic that crossed both their faces told me they understood perfectly what that meant. But what they didn't know was that I had one more revelation that would change everything. The call came at 7:30 the next morning. David's voice was strained, careful, like he was navigating a minefield with every word. Mom, could we talk? Rachel and I have been up all night discussing everything, and we'd like to understand the situation better. I was sitting in my kitchen, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper like any other Tuesday morning. Except yesterday, I detonated a bomb in the middle of my family's assumptions about reality, and now we were all dealing with the fallout. What would you like to understand, David? The financial arrangement, how this all works. He paused, clearly struggling with words that had never been part of his vocabulary before. Whether we're about to lose our home. Come over this evening, I said. 7 o'clock. We'll talk. They arrived promptly at 7, both of them looking like they'd aged years in the past 24 hours. Rachel carried a manila folder that she clutched like a lifeline, and David's usually confident demeanor had been replaced by something approaching humility. Coffee? I offered, leading them into my small living room. Please, Rachel said, and I was surprised by the genuine gratitude in her voice. As I prepared the coffee, I could hear them talking quietly in the living room, not the angry whispers of yesterday, but the subdued tones of people trying to solve a problem they were only beginning to understand. I returned with 3 mugs and settled into my favorite chair. You said you wanted to understand the situation, I began. What specifically do you want to know? David opened Rachel's folder and pulled out what appeared to be several printed documents. We looked up Sullivan Property Holdings online. The company owns 11 properties in Connecticut, all residential rentals. The total value is, he swallowed hard. The total estimated value is over $4 million. 4.2 actually, based on last year's assessments, I confirmed, though current market values would be higher. Rachel leaned forward. Margaret, I need to ask you something directly. Are you wealthy? I considered how to answer that question. Wealthy is a relative term. Am I financially secure? Yes. Do I have more money than I could spend in my remaining years? Probably. Have I been living modestly by choice rather than necessity? Absolutely. But why? David's voice was filled with genuine confusion. Why live in this apartment when you could afford anything? Why let us think you were struggling? Because I wanted to know who you really were when the stakes were low, I said simply. When you thought I needed you instead of the other way around. David pulled out the last document from their folder. This is what we wanted to show you. We contacted a realtor today and got a market analysis for our house. If we sold it. He paused, clearly struggling with the implications. We could buy a smaller place outright and still have money left over. I looked at the papers without touching them. That's a nice analysis, David, but you can't sell a house you don't own. We know that, but you could sell it, and we could use our security deposit as a down payment somewhere else. He took a deep breath. We're prepared to move out voluntarily if that's what you want. We just need time to find something appropriate for the kids. It was a reasonable offer, delivered with more grace than I'd expected from either of them. But it also revealed that they still didn't understand the real choice they were facing. Before we discuss your options, I said, I need to tell you about another aspect of this situation that you're not aware of. Rachel's face went pale again. I was beginning to think that was her default response to new information these days. When I purchased your house through Sullivan Property Holdings, I continued, I structured the deal as a lease-to-own agreement. You've been building equity with every payment, though at a reduced rate because of the below-market rent. David frowned. What does that mean exactly? I reached into my own folder and pulled out the original contract. It means that after 5 years of consistent payments and property maintenance, you have the option to purchase the house for the remaining balance. Based on your payment history and current property value, that balance would be approximately $280,000. The silence that followed was profound. $280,000? Rachel repeated slowly. For a house worth over $500,000? For a house you've been living in, maintaining, and treating as your own for 3 years, I corrected. David stared at the contract like it was written in a foreign language. You're saying we could buy our house for $280,000? If you complete the 5-year agreement, yes, you have 2 years remaining. Rachel's voice was barely a whisper. Why would you do that? I looked at them both, these two people who had hurt me so deeply yesterday, who were trying so hard today to understand a generosity they'd never recognized. Because I love my son, I said simply. Because I wanted my grandchildren to grow up in a stable, beautiful home. David was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he finally grasped the magnitude of what had been happening behind the scenes of his life. But Rachel asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. What happens now? She said. After yesterday, after everything that's been said and done, what happens to the agreement? I set down my coffee and looked directly into her eyes. That, I said, depends entirely on what you do next. And then I told them about the choice they had to make. You have 2 options, I said, pulling out 2 separate documents I'd prepared that afternoon. Option 1, we terminate the lease-to-own agreement immediately. I'll give you 60 days to find alternative housing, return your security deposit, and provide positive references. You'll walk away with clean credit and enough time to find something suitable for your family. David wiped his eyes with his sleeve, struggling to focus on the practical details. And option 2? Option 2. We renegotiate the agreement based on a new understanding of our relationship. You continue living in the house, building equity toward eventual ownership, but under different terms. Rachel leaned forward. What kind of different terms? I opened the second document and set it on the coffee table between us. Market rate rent, effective immediately. No more subsidies, no more hidden gifts. You pay what the house is actually worth, and you earn the purchase option through your own efforts rather than my generosity. The numbers on the page made Rachel gasp audibly. Market rate for their house was $3,400 per month, nearly double what they'd been paying. That's impossible, David said, scanning the figures. We can't afford that. My salary, Rachel's income, the kids' expenses. He trailed off, clearly running calculations in his head. Then you choose option 1, I said calmly. There's no shame in that choice. You've been living above your means with my help. And now you'll find something within your actual budget. Rachel was studying the document intently, her marketing mind clearly working through possibilities. What about the equity we've already built? Do we lose that if we leave? No. If you choose to leave, I'll purchase your equity position for fair market value. Based on your payment history and current property values, that would be approximately $47,000. David slumped back in his chair. So either we leave and downsize significantly, or we stay and struggle to make payments we can barely afford. Those are the financial realities, I confirmed. But there's a third element to both options that has nothing to do with money. They both looked at me expectantly. If you choose to stay, if you choose to pay market rate and work toward earning this house on your own merits, then we also rebuild our family relationship from the ground up. No more casual dismissals. No more conditional acceptance based on what I can provide. Rachel's voice was barely audible. What would that look like? It would look like respect, I said simply. It would look like including me in family decisions that affect me. It would look like acknowledging that I'm Tommy and 6-year-old Sarah's grandmother, regardless of my employment status or gift-giving capacity. David was crying again. But this time I thought the tears might be more about understanding than self-pity. Mom, I never realized. I never saw how we were treating you. I know you didn't, I said gently. That's what made it so painful. It wasn't malicious. It was worse than that. It was indifferent. Rachel set down the contract and looked at me directly. If we choose option 2, if we stay and pay market rate, how do we prove to you that we can do better? It was a fair question, and I appreciated that she was asking it. We start with small things, I said. Sunday dinners that I'm invited to because you want my company, not because you need a babysitter. Holiday celebrations where my presence matters more than my presence. David nodded slowly. And if we mess up? If we fall back into old patterns? Then we address it directly, instead of letting resentment build for years, I said. I take responsibility for my part in this too, David. I should have spoken up when I felt excluded. Rachel was quiet for a long moment, studying her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, less defensive, more vulnerable. I owe you an apology that goes far beyond yesterday's dinner, she said. I've been threatened by you for years. Instead of learning from you, I've been pushing you away. It was the most honest thing Rachel had said to me in years. I never wanted to compete with you, I told her. I wanted to support you. David was looking between us like he was watching a revelation unfold in real time. So what do we do? What's the next step? I gathered up all the documents and returned them to my folder. You take these contracts home and discuss them privately. Really discuss them. Not just the financial implications, but what kind of family you want to be going forward. How long do we have to decide? Rachel asked. Take the time you need, but understand that staying in the house without a new agreement isn't an option. If you can't commit to market rate rent by January 1st, then we move forward with option 1. They stood to leave, both of them moving with the careful deliberation of people whose world had shifted fundamentally in the space of 2 days. At the door, David turned back to me. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. If we choose to leave, if we decide we can't afford to stay, will you still be our family? Will you still be part of Tommy and Sarah's lives? The question broke my heart a little, because it revealed how completely he'd misunderstood the stakes of this situation. David, I said gently, my love for you and your children has never been contingent on where you live or how much rent you pay. What I've been fighting for isn't the right to be your landlord. I've been fighting for the right to be your mother. He nodded, tears threatening again, and they left. I sat in my quiet apartment afterward, thinking about the conversation and the choice they now faced. Part of me hoped they would choose to stay, to do the hard work of rebuilding our relationship while learning to stand on their own financially. What I knew for certain was that whatever they decided, it would be an honest decision based on truth rather than illusion. The next morning, my phone rang at 8 o'clock sharp, but the voice on the other end wasn't David or Rachel. It was someone I never expected to hear from again. Mrs. Sullivan, this is Janet Crawford from Hartford Insurance. I'm calling about your severance package settlement. I nearly dropped the phone. Hartford Insurance had laid me off 6 months ago with a standard severance package that I'd already received. There shouldn't be any settlement to discuss. I'm sorry. Could you repeat that? I said, sinking into my kitchen chair. The wrongful termination settlement, Mrs. Sullivan. The legal department has been trying to reach you for weeks. We have a substantial check waiting for you. My mind raced. I wasn't wrongfully terminated. The company downsized, and I was part of the reduction. It was completely legitimate. Janet's voice took on a careful, professional tone. Ma'am, I think there might be some confusion. Could you come in this afternoon? Mr. Peterson in legal needs to speak with you directly about the circumstances of your departure. 2 hours later, I sat across from James Peterson, Hartford's head legal counsel, in a conference room that smelled of coffee and expensive leather. The man looked uncomfortable, shuffling papers and avoiding direct eye contact. Mrs. Sullivan, I'm going to be frank with you. We made a mistake. What kind of mistake? Your termination was processed incorrectly. You weren't supposed to be included in the downsizing. Your department was actually being expanded, and your position was supposed to be promoted to senior claims director. I stared at him. That's impossible. My supervisor, Linda Parker, told me specifically that my position was being eliminated. Peterson's expression grew even more uncomfortable. Ms. Parker submitted falsified documentation about departmental restructuring. She recommended your termination to make room for her nephew's promotion. When our internal audit discovered the irregularities, we immediately began investigating. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Are you saying Linda got me fired to give my job to her nephew? I'm saying Ms. Parker has been terminated for employment fraud, and we're prepared to offer you a substantial settlement along with immediate reinstatement to your rightful position. He slid a document across the table. The settlement amount made my eyes widen. 6 figures, more than I'd made in 2 years of salary. There's also the matter of your rightful position, Peterson continued. The senior director role comes with a 40% salary increase and a signing bonus. If you're interested in returning, we can have you back to work by Monday. I looked at the papers, thinking about David and Rachel at home, agonizing over contracts and decisions about a future they thought hung in the balance, thinking about how they'd spent 6 months treating me like a failure when I'd actually been the victim of fraud. I need to ask you something, Mr. Peterson. How long have you known about this situation? We discovered the irregularities 6 weeks ago. It's taken this long to complete our investigation and locate you for the settlement offer. 6 weeks. They'd known the truth for 6 weeks, while I'd been playing the role of the unemployed mother who couldn't afford Christmas gifts, while my own family had been treating me like a burden based on circumstances that were never real to begin with. The irony was so thick, I almost laughed out loud. I'll need some time to consider your offer, I said, gathering the papers. I drove home in a daze, the settlement papers on the passenger seat like evidence of some cosmic joke. Everything. The job loss, the financial testing, the dramatic revelations about property ownership, all of it had been built on a foundation that was crumbling, even as I'd been constructing my elaborate lessons about family loyalty. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Can we meet tomorrow morning? Rachel and I have made our decision. I stared at the message, thinking about the choice they'd been wrestling with, the financial calculations they'd been running, the soul-searching they'd been doing about what kind of family they wanted to be. All of it based on the premise that I was a woman who'd lost her job and needed to test their love to feel secure. But now I wasn't that woman anymore. Now I was a woman who'd been wrongfully terminated, who was being offered a substantial settlement and a better job than I'd ever had. A woman whose entire narrative about herself and her circumstances had just been rewritten by a lawyer in a conference room. I called David back instead of texting. "Hi, Mom," he said, and his voice was different, warmer, more open than it had been in months. "I know we're supposed to meet tomorrow, but I wanted you to know that Rachel and I talked all night. We've decided we want to stay in the house and pay market rate. We want to do this right." My heart should have soared at those words. This was what I'd been hoping for, a sign that they understood what needed to change, that they were willing to work for both the house and the relationship. Instead, I felt a crushing weight of guilt. "David, before you make any final decisions, I need to tell you something important." "What is it?" I looked at the settlement papers again, at the dollar amount that would change everything. "Can you and Rachel come over tonight instead of tomorrow? There's been a development that affects everything we discussed." "What kind of development?" "The kind that changes the entire story," I said quietly. 2 hours later, David and Rachel sat in my living room again, but this time the energy was completely different. They'd arrived holding hands, presenting a united front, ready to take responsibility for their mistakes and work toward a better relationship. I was about to shatter that resolve with a truth that made everything more complicated. "I got a call from Hartford Insurance today," I began, and told them everything. When I finished, the silence was absolute. "So you never actually lost your job permanently," David said slowly. "You were illegally fired by someone who wanted to steal your position. And now they're offering you your job back with a promotion and a settlement," Rachel added, clearly struggling with the numbers. "Yes. So the financial testing, the property revelations, all of it," David trailed off. "All of it was based on circumstances that weren't real," I finished. "I've been playing the role of someone who lost her job and needed to test your loyalty, when the truth is, I was a victim of workplace fraud the whole time." But as I looked at their faces, at the hope and confusion and determination there, I realized we still had one more choice to make. And this time, it would be based on who we really were, not who we thought we had to be. The next morning brought another phone call that changed everything again. This time, it was Patricia from Prestige Property Management, and her voice carried an urgency I'd never heard before. "Margaret, we have a problem. The Hendersons next door to your Maple Drive property called this morning. There was a break-in last night, and they're concerned about suspicious activity around your house. I sat up straighter in bed. What kind of break-in? Someone forced entry through the back door. The police were called, but by the time they arrived, whoever it was had gone. Nothing appears to be missing, but there are signs someone was searching through papers in David's home office. My blood ran cold. Are David and Rachel okay? The children? They weren't home, according to the neighbors. They left yesterday evening and haven't returned. I tried calling David's number, but it goes straight to voicemail. I was already reaching for my clothes. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The drive to Maple Drive felt like an eternity. 2 police cars were parked in the driveway when I arrived. I identified myself to the officer at the door as the property owner and was escorted inside to survey the damage. The back door frame was splintered where someone had forced it open. In David's office, papers were scattered across the floor, desk drawers pulled out, filing cabinet hanging open. But the expensive electronics were untouched, the children's toys undisturbed. This wasn't a random burglary. Detective Morrison, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, showed me through the scene. Whoever did this was looking for something specific. Documents, most likely. Any idea what someone might want from your tenant's files? I thought about the contracts we'd been discussing, the property arrangements, the financial documents that revealed the true nature of our relationship, possibly information about the property ownership or lease agreements. Before I could elaborate, my phone rang. David's number. Mom? His voice was strained, frightened. Patricia told me about the break-in. Are you at the house? I'm here with the police. David, where are you? Are you and Rachel and the kids safe? We're in a hotel in Hartford. We left last night after... He paused, and I could hear Rachel's voice in the background. Mom, there's something we didn't tell you yesterday. After you told us about the Hartford settlement, Rachel got a call. What kind of call? Someone claiming to be from a law firm. They said they were investigating financial irregularities in property ownership transfers and needed to speak with us about our rental agreement. Detective Morrison was listening intently to my side of the conversation. What did you tell them? I asked. Nothing. Rachel thought it was strange timing, calling right after we'd learned about your situation, so we decided to pack some things and leave until we could figure out what was going on. Smart woman, that Rachel. Her marketing background had apparently given her good instincts about suspicious timing. David, I need you to stay where you are. Don't come back to the house until we understand what's happening. Detective Morrison gestured for the phone. Mr. Sullivan, this is Detective Morrison with Hartford Police. Can you describe the person who called you? I could hear David putting the call on speaker. It was a man, professional sounding. He said he was from Goldman and Associates, representing some kind of investigation into elder financial abuse cases. The detective and I exchanged glances. Did he give you any specifics about this investigation? She asked. Rachel's voice came through the phone now. He mentioned Margaret by name. Said there were questions about whether she was using property ownership to manipulate family members financially. He wanted to meet with us to discuss our situation as potential victims. The pieces started clicking together in my mind, and the picture they formed made my stomach drop. Detective, I said quietly, I think someone is trying to steal my property. What makes you say that? I thought about the timing, the call coming immediately after David and Rachel learned about my Hartford settlement, the break-in happening the same night they'd wisely decided to leave. Someone wants to create a legal case that I'm financially abusing my family through property manipulation. Detective Morrison nodded grimly. It's an increasingly common scam. Target elderly property owners, manufacture evidence of financial abuse, then use legal challenges to force property sales or transfers. My phone was still connected to David and Rachel. Mom, David said, his voice tight with worry. How would someone know about our situation? How would they know about the property arrangements or the Hartford settlement? That was the question that made everything truly terrifying. I don't know, I said. But David, I need you to do something for me. I need you to call Janet Crawford at Hartford Insurance and verify that our conversation yesterday was real. Why would you... He stopped, understanding hitting him. Oh, God. You think the Hartford call was fake, too? I think someone has been watching our family very carefully, I said. Detective Morrison was already on her radio, calling for additional units and requesting a fraud investigation team. But as I stood in my son's ransacked office, looking at the scattered papers that represented years of my careful planning and generosity, I realized that this attack on my family was about more than money. Someone knew about our Christmas dinner disaster. Someone knew about our property arrangements. Someone knew about our family dynamics well enough to craft the perfect scheme to tear us apart, which meant someone had been watching us for a very long time. The question was, who? The call to Hartford Insurance confirmed my worst fears. Janet Crawford didn't exist. The legal department had no record of any wrongful termination investigation involving my case. The settlement offer that had seemed too good to be true was exactly that, a complete fabrication. I sat in David's kitchen, surrounded by police officers and my terrified family, trying to piece together how someone had orchestrated such an elaborate deception. The fake Hartford call had been perfectly timed, arriving just as David and Rachel were wrestling with the biggest decision of their marriage. "Mrs. Sullivan," Detective Morrison said, setting down her phone after a conversation with the fraud unit. "We've traced the number that called you yesterday. It's a burner phone, purchased with cash 2 weeks ago. The Goldman & Associates firm that contacted your family doesn't exist either." Rachel was holding Tommy and 6-year-old Sarah close on the sofa, both children confused and frightened by the sudden hotel stay and the police presence in their home. "I don't understand," she said. "Why would someone go to such elaborate lengths? What do they gain from this?" Detective Morrison consulted her notes. "Property fraud schemes like this usually work in stages. First, they destabilize the family relationship through manufactured crises. Then they pose as helpful legal representation for the victims of financial abuse. Finally, they use the legal process to force property sales or transfers." David was pacing again, his engineer's mind clearly working through the logistics. "But how did they know so much about our specific situation? They knew about Mom's job loss, about the property arrangements, even about our Christmas dinner problems." That was the question that had been haunting me since this began. "I think," I said slowly, "someone has been watching our family for months, maybe longer." "Who would do that?" Rachel asked. "Someone who knew about my property investments, someone who understood that I had assets worth targeting." I thought about the people who had access to that information. Property records are public, but the connection between Sullivan Property Holdings and my personal identity isn't obvious unless you know what to look for. Detective Morrison was making notes. "Who knows about your business arrangements, Mrs. Sullivan?" "My attorney, my accountant, the property management company." I paused, thinking. "And anyone who might have accessed my personal files during employment at Hartford Insurance." The room went quiet as the implications sank in. "Linda Parker," David said quietly. "The supervisor who got you fired. She would have had access to your personal information, your emergency contacts, maybe even your financial records from your employment file." Detective Morrison looked up from her notepad. "Tell me about this Linda Parker." I explained the employment fraud, the wrongful termination, Linda's nephew getting promoted to my position. As I spoke, I could see the detective's expression growing more serious. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need to make some calls. Based on what you're telling me, this Linda Parker sounds like she could be our primary suspect." The technical team arrived an hour later and found 3 hidden cameras and 2 audio recording devices planted throughout the house. One camera in the kitchen had a clear view of the table where David, Rachel, and I had our emotional conversations. Another in the living room had recorded every family gathering for the past 2 months. The devices were installed professionally, the tech specialist explained. Someone with experience. They gained access during what appears to be a routine service call. We found evidence that someone posed as a cable repair technician about 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago. Right around the time Linda Parker would have realized her employment fraud was being investigated. "She's been inside your family's digital life completely," the specialist continued, showing us a sophisticated keylogger program on David's computer. "She knew about every financial transaction, every email, every Google search related to your situation." David stared at the screen in horror. "She saw our bank statements, our savings account, our discussions about whether we could afford to stay in the house. She knew exactly how to calibrate her approach," I said grimly. "She knew when to make the fake Hartford call for maximum impact." Detective Morrison finished another phone call and turned back to us. "I have an update. Linda Parker disappeared 3 days ago, right around the time you had your property inspection. Her apartment is empty, her car is gone, and she never reported to her probation officer. Probation officer? Rachel asked. She was arrested for employment fraud 2 weeks ago, but posted bail. She was supposed to remain in the area pending trial, but she's apparently decided to run. I thought about the elaborate deception, the psychological manipulation, the way Linda had used our own family dynamics against us. Detective, is she working alone? We don't think so. The level of sophistication suggests this is part of a larger operation. We're coordinating with FBI Financial Crimes Unit now. Tommy had been listening quietly from his position next to Sarah on the sofa. Now he looked up with the serious expression that reminded me so much of David at that age. "Grandma," he said, "does this mean the bad lady was lying about everything?" I knelt down beside him, thinking about how to explain this to an 8-year-old who'd been an innocent target of surveillance and manipulation. "Yes, Tommy. She was lying about everything. She wanted to trick our family into fighting with each other. But we're not fighting anymore, right?" I looked around the room at David, who was helping the police catalog evidence, at Rachel, who was comforting Sarah, at the home that had been violated but not destroyed. "No," I said, "we're not fighting anymore." That's when Detective Morrison's phone rang with the news that would change everything again. "We've located Linda Parker," Detective Morrison announced after hanging up her phone. "She's been arrested at a hotel in Boston along with 2 accomplices. They're bringing her back to Hartford for questioning." David looked up from the papers he'd been sorting. "Does this mean it's over?" "The immediate threat to your family is over," Detective Morrison said. "But there's more to this story than just Linda Parker." She pulled out her notepad and flipped to a fresh page. "During the arrest, we discovered that Linda Parker has been working with a sophisticated property fraud ring. They target elderly homeowners with substantial assets and complicated family relationships." "How many families have they done this to?" Rachel asked. "At least 15 that we know of across 3 states. All elderly property owners, all with adult children who had access to financial information." Detective Morrison looked directly at me. "Mrs. Sullivan, there's something else you need to know. Linda Parker didn't choose your family randomly." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" 3 years ago, when you purchased the house on Maple Drive through Sullivan Property Holdings, you worked with a commercial real estate broker to complete the transaction. That broker was Maria Parker, Linda's sister. The room went completely silent. Maria Parker knew everything about your financial situation, your investment portfolio, and your family arrangements because you disclosed it all during the property purchase process. She knew you were buying this house specifically for David and Rachel, and she knew about the below-market lease arrangement. I sat down heavily in David's kitchen chair, trying to process this revelation. Maria's been feeding information to Linda about our family for years. That's correct. Maria Parker declared bankruptcy 8 months ago, the same time Linda's employment fraud began. They've both been desperate for money and decided to target the families from Maria's client list. Rachel was staring at me with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Margaret, this means they've been planning this for months, watching us, learning our routines, figuring out our weaknesses." Detective Morrison nodded grimly. "Linda Parker used her position at Hartford Insurance to access your employment records and personal information. When she got caught and realized she was going to be fired, she and her sister accelerated their timeline for the property fraud." David shook his head slowly. "So, the Christmas dinner disaster, our treatment of Mom, they were counting on us being dysfunctional enough to fall for their scheme." "Exactly. They needed evidence of family conflict to support their elder abuse allegations. The surveillance equipment was gathering that evidence for months." I thought about Sarah, my 6-year-old granddaughter, innocently talking to Linda during her neighborhood photography sessions. The violation felt even more personal now. "Detective," I said, "what happens to families who fall for this type of scheme? Usually they end up losing their properties for far below market value, and the family relationships are destroyed permanently. The victims often don't realize they've been scammed until years later." Tommy tugged on my sleeve. "Grandma, are the bad ladies going to jail?" "Yes, sweetheart. They're going to jail for a very long time." Detective Morrison packed up her equipment as the technical team finished documenting the surveillance devices. Mrs. Sullivan, I have to say, in 20 years of investigating fraud cases, I've never seen a family come out of something like this stronger than when they went in. Rachel was quiet for a long moment, then asked the question I'd been dreading. Margaret, where does this leave us? With the house? With the contracts? With everything we've been discussing? I'd been thinking about that question since the moment we'd discovered the surveillance equipment. Everything we'd been through, the Christmas dinner humiliation, the property revelations, the contract negotiations, all of it had taken place under Linda Parker's watchful eye. She'd been counting on our dysfunction, betting that we'd tear ourselves apart and create the perfect conditions for her fraud scheme. But we hadn't torn ourselves apart. Despite everything, despite months of manipulation and surveillance and psychological pressure, we'd started to find our way back to each other. I think, I said slowly, that Linda Parker made a fundamental miscalculation. What do you mean? David asked. She assumed that financial pressure and family secrets would destroy our relationships. She was counting on us being too proud, too stubborn, too damaged to work through our problems. I looked around the room at these people I loved, who'd been put through an ordeal no family should have to endure. But we did work through our problems. We had honest conversations. We made hard choices. We started to rebuild trust and respect and love. Rachel's eyes were bright with tears. So what happens now? I pulled out the contracts we'd been discussing, the documents that had represented such difficult choices just days ago. Now we make decisions based on who we really are, not who Linda Parker wanted us to become. I tore up both contracts. Margaret, David protested. What are you doing? I'm starting over, I said, with a clean slate and complete honesty. And then I told them what I'd really decided. I'm giving you the house, free and clear. No more rent, no more contracts, no more property management companies. I'm transferring the deed to your names. The silence that followed was profound. Rachel was the first to speak. Margaret, we can't accept that. It's too much. You're not accepting it, I said gently. You're receiving it. There's a difference. But Mom, why? David asked, his voice rough with emotion. After everything that's happened, after the way we treated you. Because family isn't about keeping score, I said. It's about loving each other even when we mess up. But I had one more thing to tell them first. There's something else, I said, pulling them both into a hug. Linda Parker made me realize something important. She was counting on our family being too broken to survive her manipulation. She thought we'd destroy ourselves and make her job easy. I pulled back to look at both their faces. But we didn't destroy ourselves. We fought for each other. We chose love over pride, honesty over comfort, connection over control. We proved that our family is stronger than her schemes. Detective Morrison was smiling as she finished packing her equipment. The FBI will need statements from all of you over the next few weeks. But the criminal case against Linda and Maria Parker is solid. You'll likely be asked to testify at their trial. What about the other families they targeted? Rachel asked. With your case as evidence, we've been able to contact 12 other families and warn them about the scheme. Several property transfers have been stopped, and we're working to help victims recover their losses. After the police left, we sat in the quiet kitchen, trying to process everything that had happened. The house felt different now, not violated, but reclaimed. The surveillance equipment was gone, the locks had been changed, and for the first time in months, we were truly alone as a family. I can't believe we almost lost each other over something that wasn't even real, David said quietly. But we didn't lose each other, Rachel pointed out. Even when we thought Margaret was testing us, even when we were angry and confused, we still chose to work things out. Tommy looked up from his coloring book. Grandma, does this mean you'll come to our house for dinner every Sunday? If you want me to. And Christmas too? I looked at Rachel, who was nodding through her tears. Especially Christmas, I said. And you're really giving us the house? Sarah asked, her 6-year-old mind struggling to understand the concept. It was always meant to be your house, sweetheart. I just wanted to make sure your parents understood how much family means. Rachel wiped her eyes with her sleeve. What happens now? I mean, practically speaking? Practically speaking, you call your lawyer tomorrow and we start the paperwork to transfer the deed. You change all your passwords and security systems. You install better locks and maybe a security camera system that you control. I paused, thinking about the bigger picture. And we start over as a family. No more hidden arrangements, No more testing, no more conditional love based on circumstances. We build something honest and strong and real. David was crying again, but this time they were tears of overwhelming gratitude rather than guilt or confusion. Mom, I need you to know something. Even before we found out about the fraud, even when we thought you were testing us, Rachel and I had decided we wanted to try harder. We wanted to be the family you deserved. And I need you to know something too, I said. Even when I was angry, even when I felt excluded and unappreciated, I never stopped loving you. I never stopped hoping we could find our way back to each other. 6 months later, we gathered around the same dining room table where I'd been humiliated and excluded. But this time, I was sitting at the head of the table, carving the turkey I'd brought to share. Rachel had made her famous stuffing. David was managing the children's excitement about presents, and the house was filled with the sound of a family that had fought for each other and won. Linda and Maria Parker were serving federal sentences for organized fraud. The FBI had used our case as a model for identifying and prosecuting similar schemes across the country. 12 other families had been contacted and offered support in recovering their losses. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was here, in this house, with these people who'd learned that love isn't about what you can provide or receive. It's about showing up, paying attention, and choosing each other every single day. As I watched Tommy and Sarah tear into their Christmas presents with 8- and 6-year-old enthusiasm, I realized that sometimes the best gifts are the ones you almost lose. Family, trust, second chances, home. The gifts that matter most are always free. And sometimes when someone tries to destroy what you have, they end up showing you exactly how strong it really was. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.